Good morning. My name is Harold Furchtgott-Roth, and I'll be your host today here at the Hudson Institute. Thank you so much for joining us today. We have a wonderful program for us. We have the new book from Jonathan Ward, The Decisive Decade. You're all going to want to read this book if you haven't already. Jonathan will be presenting a brief introduction of the book for the first part of our program today. And then we'll have a discussion with Jonathan and David Feith and Roslyn Layton. Roslyn has organized this event today, and I want to thank her so much for doing a great job of orchestrating this. Then at the end of the program, we'll take questions from our audience and from our online audience. Please submit your questions to Hudson here today. So please join me in welcoming Jonathan Ward, my colleague here at the Hudson Institute. We're very honored to have you present your book today. Thank you so much.
Okay, good morning, everybody, and thank you for being here. Roslyn and Harold and David have kindly invited me to use my latest book, The Decisive Decade, in a way to frame what we're going to talk about today. I mean, who we really have in this room, who we really have on this panel, are people that are deeply experienced in the telecommunications and technology space, in the nature of export controls and how these things work, if and when the U.S. would like to take meaningful action in the competition with China. And the way that I've set up The Decisive Decade, which is a follow-on to my first book, China's Vision of Victory, which is one of the first to explain the global strategy of the Chinese government in their own words and documents, Decisive Decade is meant to be a strategy for action when we decide that it's time to win this contest, not just to compete or manage. And there was a good article in Foreign Affairs yesterday with Matt Pottinger and Mike Gallagher talking about how we have to win this contest. And someone who's advocated for that for a while, I'm happy to see that gaining ground. But let's focus on what we have at stake, why we might want to deal with some of the toughest things that can be done in the chip space, in the technology space in general, in export controls in general. So to begin with, what we're dealing with, in my view, is that the Chinese Communist Party envisions a turning point in history. It envisions a turning point in which the People's Republic of China becomes the preeminent power in world affairs, surpassing the United States economically and militarily, and ushering in a new era of uncontested totalitarian power. They call this vision, quote, the great rejuvenation of the Chinese nation. So China's leaders have made clear to the world how they intend to reach this turning point. The Communist Party's grand strategy is global. From Asia to Africa to Latin America to Europe, programs including the Belt and Road Initiative, dual circulation, and the community of common destiny of mankind show us the scope and depth of their strategy and their ambitions. And China's, quote, strategic partners in Russia and Iran have already initiated or supported wars in Europe and the Middle East, testing American resources, testing American resolve, and testing our alliance system. So the rise of China was never going to be peaceful. The intent of the Chinese Communist Party has always been the destruction of the American-led world order. And at the center of China's vision of victory is the intent to build and use newfound military power, not only through proxies and partners, but by the Chinese Communist Party itself. Unless we think that that's all a tough framing of this situation, here's what Admiral Aquilino said just a couple weeks ago on Capitol Hill, and I wish this were, sort of heard in every home and boardroom and C-suite, in addition to the fact that it was heard in Washington. But he said this: the People's Republic of China is the only country that has the capability, capacity, and intent to upend the international order. Even amidst slowing economic growth, the PRC continues its aggressive military buildup, modernization, and coercive gray zone operations. All indications point to the PLA meeting President Xi Jinping's directive to be ready to invade Taiwan by 2027. Furthermore, the PLA's actions indicate their ability to meet Xi's preferred timeframe to unify Taiwan with mainland China by force if directed. And H.R. McMaster, a former national security advisor who very kindly wrote the foreword to my book, said this some years ago: since the 1990s, China has increased their military spending 800%. It's the largest peacetime military buildup in history. And how do we get here? It's really something that's been with us the whole time. China's leaders have envisioned a return to global power since the founding of the People's Republic in 1949. As one of the leading historians of modern China said it, Mao's revolution never took it as its ultimate goal, the communist seizure of power in China. Rather, it aimed to reassert China's central position in the world. And as Xinhua news agency said just a few years ago, by 2050, 2 centuries after the Opium Wars, which plunged the Middle Kingdom into a period of hurt and shame, China is set to regain its might and reascend to the top of the world. And they're going to do this on the time frame that I think people in Washington are familiar with, but it's worth addressing again the 2 centenaries, the anniversaries of the founding of the Communist Party of China in 2021, and then the centennial of the founding of the People's Republic of China in 2049, which is their long-term sort of symbolic goal. So in the decisive decade, what I wanted to do was explore how to get both outside their timeframes and inside their timeframes and disrupt their global grand strategy. And the way to do that, in my view, is to go for the roots and the trunk of the tree, which is the economic power of China. I think that's what America has to do, when we are ready to really get serious about this. So I laid out the book in the 4 arenas of classical Western grand strategy, putting economics first, so economics, then diplomatic power, then military power, then the arena of ideas. But today, I think for the purposes of this discussion, we should focus on the economic side. And that's about disrupting the centerpiece of what they seek to do. I mean, they always envisioned surpassing the United States. This goes back to the 50s. Mao used to talk about how China would ultimately surpass the US economically by virtue of their large population. Today, I think it's more common to think of China as a place that's saddled with debt, slowing growth, demographic decline. But for the last 20 years, you've had a pretty robust discussion of China's economic growth. I mean, many of our leading CEOs have talked about how China would ultimately be bigger than the US, and hence their investment drives and business builds into the People's Republic of China. But the Communist Party itself really believed that that was how they were going to go about winning the century ahead, to lock in China as the center of the global trading system. I think they have been rather successful at doing that in certain ways, to use things like the Belt and Road Initiative to tie the major continents of the world back to China. I mean, they have surpassed the US in terms of total volume of trade, not only with Africa and sort of East Asia, Indo-Pacific, but also with Latin America now. And the Belt and Road ultimately ends in Europe. So it's an absolutely global strategy. And their military strategy is designed to, as they see it, protect, quote, the ceaseless expansion of our overseas interests. So it is an overlay of military and economics. But they rely entirely on the United States in order to do this, and on Western markets. I mean, you wouldn't have really had the rise of China without American contributions to that rise. I mean, technology transfer, technology theft, of course, enormous amounts of capital deployed into China, principally to build it up as an industrial base to supply Western markets. And then, of course, the trading relationship with the United States that allowed them to run a surplus to the tune of hundreds of billions of dollars for many years. And it's not just with us, that's with other advanced democracies around the world. And all of that was then converted essentially into military power. And here's what, just to go back to some of the primary source that gives us a sense of how they see things. China Daily in 2017, this is before the trade war, this is before any real realization of the China challenge was animating Washington, said this: "Excellence of weaponry is no longer a big issue for the People's Liberation Army. Thanks to decades of strenuous efforts supported by the robust Chinese economy, the Chinese defense industry has cleared the technological bottleneck and the arms embargo of the West to produce some of the most advanced weapons in the world. No one can deny that China's rise has been peaceful. If China can rise smoothly to the top of the world without firing a single bullet, it will certainly be able to claim the moral high ground. This may sound harsh, but the truth is that peace is not a godsend. It often has to be earned, sometimes at the cost of war." So for me, as a historian of essentially the foreign policy of the People's Republic of China, including their military adventures in the 20th century, it's pretty clear that they're building all of this, they're using it, they've used the US-China economic relationship to position themselves for conflict in the Pacific. And yet, I think what we can really do is redefine this contest, hold them back, ensure that they never surpass us, disrupt their growth, sort of disassemble their global interests, and ultimately also win the contest for military superiority, which derives from military power. And that's really what I think the US needs to focus on. So the strategy that I proposed in the economic arena is called economic containment. That does go back to the Cold War. It was a term that was used and principally by Michael Mastanduno to describe some of our efforts to use export controls against the Soviet Union. But I think if we broaden that idea and think about the whole of the Chinese economy, economic containment is this thing we can do in this brief moment while we still have genuine economic superiority. And if you're able to do that, and then the corollary to it is a second pillar, which is rebuilding the U.S., securing our supply chains, ensuring that we take the lead in a moment in economic history that's about to happen, Industry 4.0, which I think will give us sort of escape velocity, allow us to make very significant increases in productivity, and then to widen the gap between our economy and theirs. And so a lot of my thinking in coming up with the Decisive Decade, I mean, I talked about this in China's Vision of Victory, which came out in 2019, was really that even though the PRC has its long-term timeframes, for the USA, this is really about winning the contest out to 2030, ensuring that while we are the dominant power, that we don't lose those advantages, that we do not allow China to make use of this moment, the 10 years at that time ahead of past 2019 that would get us to 2030. I mean, don't allow them to close the gap while there still is a gap. So historically, the US share of global GDP has been as high as 40% in 1960 after the Second World War and the baby boom. Today, it's about 23, 24%, but it does fluctuate. I mean, the Reagan years, it went back up to about 35%. Meanwhile, China's only at about 18%. So we do have this advantage in GDP. Then I think we actually have a much larger advantage when it comes to national wealth. If you look at Credit Suisse estimates, there's about $200 trillion worth of wealth in the global economy, but the US has the largest single share at 126 trillion net national wealth versus China at about 75. So you're talking about a 30% gap versus an 18% gap. And then if you go to capital markets, I mean, I think that's where this really gets interesting, because in that perspective, I mean, the US is 40% of global equity markets in a $100 trillion global equity market. According to SIFMA in 2022, the US was 40%, China was about 10%. And that was before the major equity sell-offs that have characterized their markets in the last couple of years. Then if you go to fixed income at about 129 trillion, the US is again 40%. China's about 15. They do have a pretty substantial bond market. But you start to add the alliance system to this, and the GDP gap becomes about 50% US allies versus, again, 17 or 18 to China. The wealth gap becomes far greater. It's about 50%, maybe 60, or depending if you add the democracies or NATO or OECD, you get even higher. And again, China's about 17%. And then if you get to equity markets, US allies, world democracies, add India to that, we're about 75% of fixed income markets, again, versus China's 15. We're about 65% of global equity markets versus China's 10. Again, so we have this economy. I mean, we built this economy. We let them in. And therefore, I think we have this chance to essentially disconnect China from, to a certain degree, and according to certain strategic industries and technologies. I mean, I've laid that all out in the book. But to start to disconnect their system, which is antithetical, I think, to ours, from some of the main elements of the world economy, hold them back, begin to establish the gap, do away with that turning point that the Communist Party sees, and ultimately return to peace through strength, preserve American economic power, which has really been the main reason that we prevailed, I think, in the contest of the last 100 years. As somebody put it to me recently, in the Second World War, it was the US that overwhelmed the Axis with our factories. We've given that kind of thing away. China now has double the manufacturing base that we have. But, I think we have this opportunity to essentially decouple, disengage according to certain things, not necessarily across the board, but in the ways that would be advantageous to the US, and then to reestablish a major economic gap between the US and China that does start to play out sort of across the century. And if we get certain things done in the 2020s, by the time you get to 2049, the demographics have set in, the debt crisis has set in, the housing crisis, I think, it matters if it becomes a financial crisis, and there are different sort of estimates on that. But bottom line, they are going to have some economic troubles. But they won't have the offset of being able to continue to have access to the major markets of the democracies, the major technologies of the democracies, and certainly the major capital markets of the democracies. So I think this does ultimately lead to a bifurcation of the global economy that's already happening, but I think it'd be better if we were driving that rather than reacting to the party as it uses its sort of indigenization drives and harassment of Western corporations to sort of execute its own strategy towards what they call, essentially indigenization and that sort of thing. So in any case, I think this can still be won through economic power. I think it can still be won peacefully if we are willing to convert economic power into military superiority and sustain that military superiority. And I think we have enormous advantages that we can either retain through action or that we lose through inaction. So to me, this is about execution at this point, executing essentially the three denials of market access, technology, and capital. If we prevent them from having access to those sorts of things, it changes their game dramatically. And just a quick word on the Chinese economy, which I think, apropos of Janet Yellen's visit a couple weeks ago, where she gave her advice to the Communist Party that says, you shouldn't be so export-driven, you should rebalance to consumer. And I don't personally believe that they're going to have, a revelation, maybe we should do that instead. I mean, that's the design of their system. I had a Chinese telecommunications executive tell me this on a flight in India some years ago before my first book came out. He said, China's economy is a giant incubator. We take technology from the West, we incubate it in the China market, and then we send it on to global markets. And that's exactly how it happens. So whether it's, whether it's steel, whether it's solar panels, whether it's electric vehicles, which was apparently a huge surprise to those who haven't been, studying the Chinese, strategy here. Any of that, I mean, it's going to be incubated in the China market, spit onto global markets. Their corporations are the fundamental instruments of their grand strategy. And we're going to continue to, I think, play this very tough game unless we start to disconnect that incubator, disrupt the commercialization of stolen technology, and then play a longer game to reestablish American commercial, sort of access and bridgeheads and superiority in other markets around the world. So I do think this is ultimately a contest for economic power that then translates into how we do militarily. And we have this moment to head it off at the pass and prevent it from becoming any worse. But to do that, we're going to have to get very serious about export controls. We're going to have to get very serious about what Treasury can do on capital markets and individual Chinese companies. And we're going to have to get very serious about their access to the U.S. and to our allies. And we cannot do this alone. It does not work for the U.S. to go it alone against China in an economic contest because this is going to involve so many other markets. So the U.S. alliance system, like-minded democracies, neutral and non-aligned states that probably would like to swing to our side as this heats up geopolitically. I mean, all of that, I think, creates an advantage for us to, possibility for us to essentially restructure the world economy in America's favor and prevent China's real underlying structures from prevailing, and then also preventing them from ever getting away with that war that they envision. Because I think, as a historian of China, it's not that they don't want to fight a war. I think they'd be quite happy to fight a war. It's that they don't want to fight a war that they will lose. And that's where we get a vote. I mean, you can deter China. Some of the work that Hudson is doing right now, I think, is some of the best in this country on real-world options we have to rebuild deterrence. But that will require capital. It will require technological superiority, and it will require, I think, a vision of victory for the United States that genuinely overwhelms the adversary in the long run, but through decisive action now. So thank you very much, and we'll take the count. Oh, sure. Yeah, thank you.
So, well, thank you, Jonathan. And let me say congratulations on your new position at Hudson. I think it was a great decision for the Hudson Institute to bring you aboard. And, you're part of a fabulous tradition of many excellent scholars in national security and foreign policy. And to have something so coherent and cohesive as this book, it's really keeping with the Hudson tradition. So, it's so apropos. And thank you, Harold, for this chance to speak today. And so what I had hoped to do in our discussion is to make a few reflections as a person who has been a policy researcher in this export administration field certainly looking at administrative state and telecommunications regulation, but to make a couple of remarks about your book. And then David, who has been in journalism, in government, in private practice now, we're going to make a couple of comments and questions to your observations. And then we will love to hear, of course, from our audience and take questions as well. So that's our plan here. So, for me, I founded a little think tank called China Tech Threat to basically address the kind of a question of Chinese government technology and, help to educate policymakers and the public about the dangers of that. And, I think you make a great point in your book about during the Cold War, U.S. could not have imagined of taking its cutting-edge space technology and selling it to the Soviet Union. They would never happen. In fact, the U.S. organized with its allies to create COCOM as a way to restrict strategic technologies so that they didn't fall into the hands of the Soviet Union. But when we look at where we are today with China, we essentially, the technology transfer we do is empowering China, our largest adversary. And so very few people, only recently have we started to make those connections. And one of the, as you talk about in your book, when you want to make a change, a strategic change, you need to have a to stop doing list, right? And I think at top of that list is the technology transfer. You talk about legal, illegal, and extra-legal transfers. The illegal transfers are huge, on the order of $600 billion of intellectual property theft. That's a huge part of the work of the DOJ. But the legal transfers that go on are encouraged by the Department of Commerce. So we have a world where maybe there'll be one Chinese government company that gets restricted, and then we think, oh, well, we're done now, and then, oh, well, let's go back to business. We're going to slap your wrist on this thing, but can we sell you some more stuff? Can we do some more trade? And that is, I think, emboldening this situation where China is getting even more industrialized compared to us. So, I think for me, a key observation was that we have a moment now to be able to address that technology transfer. So this is not to say that work of trying to define what we want to restrict and how, that's hard work. And even the things that have been restricted, let's say SMIC, it's a large semiconductor manufacturer in China, they find workarounds. And you can't stop when, let's say you want to sell this technology to SMIC, or you sell it to a country where it's authorized, and then they resell it to China. So there's a lot of workarounds, the systems are gamed, and that's very different than, let's say, if you go to a treasury and simply say, we're going to impose sanctions on a country, as we did with South Africa during apartheid, or you impose sanctions on a company. So even the nature of how we've tried to do this in a rule of law fashion has been quite fraught. And the other part of this is, if those of you may know, we went through a major export administrative reform in 2018. And that really empowered Department of Commerce, Bureau of Industry and Security to focus on the strategic technologies. And the big debate has been that they willingly slow walk it, they don't enforce it, they think it's too difficult, they don't have the budget, this, that, and the other. I think it's something like there's 2 enforcement officers in China to check on all of the BIS restrictions. And so it's so difficult to do. But even in the case where we have known Chinese military fabs like YMTC and CXMT, the process to get them on the entity list takes years. And so in the meantime, US companies sell their tool-making equipment to them, and there's nothing, we can't do anything about it. And they get a high price for it because it's extremely valuable. So I know that's quite a lead up there, but the point is our wonderful rule of law world that we live in is sometimes very clumsy or slow to address strategic threats. And I think you point out, I think as you said before, the day that there's an invasion, no one's going to take Tim Cook's call, right? It's going to be too late when you, if you wait too long. So, but the other part of this, there may be other technological means that we can do where a regulatory state falls short. So, for example, the tool-making equipment, the semiconductor tool-making equipment, can be enabled with sensors that disable the equipment when they are in a country where they should not be. So, for example, it has been found U.S. chip-making machines are found in the Russia war state. So they're helping, support the war against Ukraine. The very opposite of our policy, which has been to try to help the Ukrainians in fighting Russia. So those are some of the challenges, and so I kind of wanted to set the stage there. And David, I'd love to get your thoughts, because you've actually been in the trenches of knowing what the will of the Congress is and trying to implement what the people want. And this is a very challenging aspect when it comes to the tactics of China, but also corporations who will find every workaround they can.
Sure. Well, the range of issues here is enormous. I'll start, I think, very appropriately with kudos for Jonathan and the book. It's really important work. It's especially valuable and I think a model to focus as much as Jonathan does in this work and in his previous on authoritative sources from the Chinese Communist Party, and on taking seriously what Chinese leaders, beginning today with Xi Jinping, say, and what they say not primarily when they're trying to influence foreign audiences, but when they are giving instructions to their own systems about goals, about policies, about how they think of their country and the world, about how they think of the United States. There has been, a really terrible failure for a long time to take seriously what the Chinese Communist Party leadership says privately, authoritatively, to its own leadership and to the 95 million members of the Communist Party about their ambitions in the world. And much of that instruction does not stay private or secret. The Chinese system obviously has a lot of secrecy to it and a lot of qualities of an underground influence organization still, given the roots of the Chinese Communist Party. But there's an enormous amount that actually the Chinese Communist Party publishes openly. It's an enormous system. They have to promulgate guidance to their system to a very significant degree openly. They take the written word seriously. They enforce that it be studied across their system. And yet, in the United States and other democratic capitals, there has not been a sufficient tradition, really for a long time, of studying what the Chinese Communist Party leadership puts out in their own ideology journals, what they put out in their military textbooks, what they put out in other authoritative organs of state and party policy in China. In recent years, there have been efforts, belated but really very important, to catch up on that and to begin to take those sources really much more seriously. And Jonathan's work is exemplary in all of that and is really very important. I think at the very general stage, I might start by pivoting a little bit away for the moment. This is consistent with what Jonathan offered, but I'll just note that in one short discussion, it's hard to get at everything, and it is challenging, I think, especially if we think about some of the challenges of a decisive decade, that limiting our discussion or even prioritizing the economic and the technological is important and understandable, and you can't do everything all at once, but we really can't forsake also the military dimension and the hard power dimension of the problem, both in terms of its magnitude and its urgency. And so I think there's a lot of interesting discussions that we might get into about, what are the relevant timeframes. But, we have acute and urgent problems in the economic and technological realms, and we have acute and urgent problems in the military and hard power realms in general. On the military and hard power front, some of that is of course especially seen in the South China Sea and over Taiwan. And I think when we think about US policy, we absolutely have a need to pursue the sort of economic and technology controls that we're primarily talking about. We also have an enormous need to increase our defense spending, improve our defense spending, to not only do some of the allied initiatives that the Biden administration and previous administrations have looked to build up with important allies in Asia. Some of that is on welcome display this week as President Biden hosts the Japanese Prime Minister and the Philippine President. That is very significant, but it is at the risk of being hollow, terribly hollow, if U.S. defense spending drops as adjusted for inflation as the Biden administration would have it. If our naval shipbuilding plans remain on current trajectory, there are really acute challenges in that area as well that are, urgent in a way that it's not simply that the military will flow out of the long-term economic strength of the competing systems. It's that there really are urgent splits now becoming visible where the U.S. and our allies are at risk of not being able to bring to bear the kind of hard power that we really need to maintain deterrence in Asia generally, across the Taiwan Strait in particular. And when we are spending as a percentage of GDP today about 3% on defense, which is half where we were during the Cold War on average. It's not half where we were during the Cold War, say, at the heights. It's half of the average. It's half of where we were in much of the Reagan administration. It's not a volume of spending that is commensurate with the challenges all around the world, or especially with China. And it's an enormous challenge that is also in the, call it purely military and defense strategy and budgeting realm. This would require significant changes in our politics. I don't want to suggest that getting increased defense spending would be easy in our politics. In fact, it would be hard, which is why the argument needs to be made and reckoned with most directly. So that is, in a sense, a point that is somewhat peripheral, but I know that it's consistent with the thrust of everything that Jonathan has offered. I'll end, I guess, for now, quickly with a note that I think that the warnings and the prescriptions on the economic and technology front are really welcome and in many ways very nicely put. It seems that one way that we might characterize what China is seeking to do and is in many ways succeeding much more than we would hope in doing in the economic and technology realms is it's not simply a reflection of strength and size, although they have a lot of that. And it's not simply a reflection of success at various advanced technology frontiers, although they have a lot of that. It's specifically, and this is written about quite openly in Chinese strategy and doctrine, it's an effort effectively to become the central force for using economic and technology strength offensively against China's enemies as leverage. That's right. And these strategies of offensive leverage and of the cultivation of coercive power against China's enemies, against the United States and our allies, is a type of challenge that we really haven't gotten postured for. Beijing is essentially seeking to become, for the 21st century, something like a super OPEC, a single country, not even a large and sometimes rivalrous coalition, a single country that has the ability to hold vulnerable the rest of the world's access to the critical inputs of modern economic life. Semiconductors, energy, especially in the renewables economy, to the extent we and other countries continue to transition there, pharmaceutical supplies, other things that we depend on at least as much as we have long depended on oil from the Middle East, which of course we don't actually depend on so much anymore, certainly not by historic standards. But our dependency on these other major inputs and supplies is still only growing when it comes to China. Their ability to leverage that against us is growing accordingly. And I think the three denials that Jonathan talks about, which is a nice sort of Chinese way of making the point, are a useful shorthand for an enormous and difficult range of policy problems. And so the work of denying China market access to the United States and to our allies, of denying China technology and capital that it gets and exploits from us, is work that I think, as we'll get into in a moment, has really only just begun. We've generated in the last few years a better recognition of the problem and a better vocabulary for beginning to talk about it. But in real material terms, for all the discussions about aspects of semiconductors, for all the progress in say tariffs on China as it relates to market access, going back to the Trump administration, these efforts broadly are only in their infancy, both in historical terms and especially as regards the scale of the challenge. And so there is much work ahead.
You may want to respond to that. Do you have some thoughts?
I think that, thank you both for your, what you've said about the book, and just really well formulated. And, David, as you just put it, China becoming a sort of, let's say, the dominant in the sort of inputs that go into the global economy. I mean, that's the thing you have to avoid. That is, I think, the part that we forget about in the way that their strategy is designed. The headlines now about demographics and housing crisis and this and that ignore the fact that they have a deep, complex, and I think highly sophisticated industrial strategy that is largely successful. The fact that Elon Musk a month ago was apparently, at least by sort of media standards, really surprised by what was happening in the electric vehicle market. That's not good. I mean, that was baked in to their industrial strategy. I mean, electric vehicles was part of Made in China 2025. I think it was one of the second or third things on the list. I briefed a major automaker on that in about 2019 and said, look, here's what's in the documents, here's what's coming, and okay, maybe. But no, this stuff does come to fruition when it is not stopped. And a major economy like China's, sure, they may have a recession, they may even have a depression. We had some before we became the dominant economic and global superpower in every possible way. But if you don't stop their strategy, in this case, I think we're going to be, quote unquote, surprised by its success at an increasingly rapid pace for the remainder of this decade and then into a very dark time in the 2030s. If we don't use the decisive decade, if we don't actually use it, we can talk about it. But if we don't execute with urgency, I think the geopolitics of the 2030s and 40s is going to be the kind of world America has not experienced in a very long time. We've never dealt with a military adversary with an equal or larger economy since the War of 1812. And that wasn't even a globalized economy. That wasn't even something where British inputs necessarily mattered to our inputs in the way that they would after the globalization period post-Cold War. So we have to use this moment to take apart their strategy. That's my view. And the thing I didn't get into enough in my remarks was just how companies are essential to this. One of the points I made in China's Vision of Victory, as David pointed out, I was very deeply immersed in the primary source. I'd been doing that at Oxford and then for Pentagon's Office of Net Assessment, looking out in the future. But I started to look into the Chinese 10Ks, the actual annual reports of their own companies, and you can see where they are talking about their adherence to China's major national strategies. And then it's pretty easy to recognize the real sort of battle space here, I think, is ultimately corporates. It's going to be a global corporate, US allied versus Chinese corporate battle space. So one of the first chapters in the book is called The Business of Victory, the American multinational enterprise versus the Chinese state-owned enterprise. And I think that's what we have to realize, is there was this period before the Second World War, and Arthur Herman at Hudson has done the kind of work on this that just made a huge light bulb go off in my head when I was trying to figure out how to win. And it's just, we ultimately got our companies onto the right side. China's using its companies, however, in a way that's completely strategic, absolutely networked and deployed globally and written into the documents. And we're going to have to be willing to start playing that game. For example, the China Communications Construction Corporation is what built the islands in the South China Sea. That wasn't the Chinese Navy, that was a Chinese company that's now on the entities list. But one of its subsidiaries is the one that's building the cranes and the ports that now have people worried. So I don't think we've learned yet how to address that problem. And I think the enormous sanctions toolkit that the US has, and which I think is largely dormant. I think we have this very powerful package of tools that were really built, I think, methodically over the past 100 years in different contexts. If you start applying that to the State-owned Assets and Supervision Commission, the large SASAC corporations, 97 companies, $4 trillion worth of revenue, 30 trillion worth of assets. I mean, that's a big fat targeting zone. A whole bunch of them are in Russia helping in the war effort. I wrote about that in here. We have a lot of reasons to go and play hardball with the actual battleships and their economic strategy. And at the same time, we're going to need to get our companies out of harm's way. I think corporate risk in China, we're seeing just the very beginning of what that means. And I think at this point, Western investors have realized the risks of Chinese equities and Chinese stocks. But I think what's coming next is to understand the risks of the American and multinational corporations that have not sort of de-risked from China. So we're going to have all of that to deal with. So I think it's policy, but it's also boardroom, C-suites, corporate strategy, corporate decision-making, and ultimately aligning that more with national security, not only to win this contest, but for the sake of these companies, which comprise so much of our equity markets and therefore so much of our pensions, 401ks, all of that. I mean, we really have to secure our system against the disruption that's coming because of geopolitical risk actually manifesting in the real world.
So let me let's dive down a little bit deeper in your economic pillar of the book. Sure. And one of the things I've enjoyed so much, you do a beautiful job about giving some historical perspective. You talked about the War of 1812, but you talk about in the 20th century, there has never been a major war where the victor did not have the superior economic base. And I think one comes away with the realization, I mean, not surprised to people at Hudson, but I think for the public, that if the United States would be in a military conflict with China, which is a peer competitor from a military perspective, I don't know how things would shake out not on our favor on the industrial side. I mean, we don't have the industrial base we used to in the United States. And even the efforts, let's say, of this administration, private administration, they're sort of too little too late in some cases. If we look at the CHIPS Act, which some of us may characterize as sort of giveaway to some companies to sprinkle things here and there and start a fab. If you go to South Korea or Taiwan, there's an entire ecosystem related to semiconductors. So for a great story today in the Wall Street Journal about building a fab in Indiana, and they need literally hundreds of engineers. Mm-hmm. And they can only get 100. They need hundreds. And whereas a fab in let's say in South Korea or Taiwan, they have pre-arranged relationships with the universities for the graduates. They have their own universities. So there's a labor pool, and there's an ecosystem. Mm-hmm. And so we used to have that in the United States for our industrial base, the labor, the input, the policy. And so where it is today, it's expensive to produce, to pay workers, to get the materials. It's impossible to build because of regulation, all of those things. So even if we look at the other side as one, we want to restrict, let's say, dangerous technology and players, of course, we want to build up our strengths. It's extremely difficult to do that quickly. And not to say that things are not underway, but if we look at the gap, and can we quickly do that in the decisive decade? And I want to encourage that, but to be realistic about what it's going to take.
Well, right, and I think we do have to. I mean, there are some things that look impossible, and you just have to execute them somehow. I mean, if we, by the end of this decade, really were able to make serious progress that could lead to sort of setting the foundations for longer-term progress. The reindustrialization of the United States, and all things considered, I mean, it's not that we completely deindustrialize, it's that we, built global supply chains principally in China, but, we still have a lot of manufacturing, we have a lot of advanced manufacturing. But I think there's no substitute for just raw industrial base. When you look at China, which now has 30% of global manufacturing output, and the US has 15. I mean, those are not the numbers with which we won the Second World War, let's say. I mean, we were 3 times the GNP of Germany and Japan combined, in the 1930s. So by the time the US was in that conflict, it was really the power of our industry, and we also had the far superior industrial base. But if you take the alliance system, we actually outpaced China in terms of total manufacturing. I mean, you have to add up NATO, you have to add Japan, you have to add South Korea. Workforce is an enormous bottleneck, I think, across a lot of industries. Shipbuilding, it's a huge bottleneck. Chips, of course, it's a bottleneck, but I think we can do that sort of thing. I mean, there is, what I dislike about the discourse over decoupling is this idea that it's so disruptive and destructive to the United States, whereas I think what it really means is having to put resources back into our own, in a way, development. consequence. I mean, the story we're describing here, where you go from an export-based manufacturing economy and then rise up the value chain, and that's the story of the entirety of East Asia. It's the story of China, and we let that go in order to essentially go into technology and finance and services. But I think as we begin to realize the genuine, sort of fundamental importance of the sort of, what I think of as like the Scrooge McDuck industries. I mean, just energy, steel, shipping, shipbuilding, the stuff you actually need. And by the way, the Chinese call it something like, Li Qiang was just talking about it on the Yellen visit. He said China has a complete economy, something of that nature, that we have a complete economy. And what he means, and I've been all over China myself, can't go back now, but back in the day, and you'd see factories where you had guys shoveling slag into furnaces, and then you'd see a General Motors like Wuling factory where it's all high-tech, state-of-the-art pressed metal, and it was just everything across the board. If they're able to actually succeed in chips, and I think there are reasons to be concerned about them being able to do that, then they're starting to build in the entire thing from steel to advanced chips, and that's the economy, I think, with which they want to go into conflict and with which they want to pursue their geopolitical and military interests, not a globally interconnected economy, but the one that's described by Xi Jinping's sort of signature initiative, dual circulation, where essentially the world is tied to China's supply chains, but China is not tied to the world's supply chains. That's what they're trying to build. I think Putin had a sort of half-baked idea of that as well, where he believed he had a whole bunch of foreign currency reserves and could therefore prosecute a war. But China has a much more sophisticated idea of how that works, but they have their own bottlenecks to that. They have not actually achieved the goals of Made in China 2025. They're not necessarily even close to that. And we're still, they require America, they require our allies, they require essentially our alliance system in order to move up, that value chain, complete their economy, have the actual technological and capital inputs to build what they're trying to build. And we can take that all away now and reinvest it in ourselves. But the other side of it is I think we have to have a demand side to anything we're going to do. I mean, industrial policy that's simply driven by subsidization and sort of securing supply chains, securing industries. I mean, there's some of that that's just absolutely necessary, and I'm not opposed to it. But I think what we really want to be able to do is create the demand drivers to actually power this through business cases from the United States, from the alliance system. So, total demand for compute in the world in a growing economy, total demand for, all the other things that can drive real investment. I think once people start to realize how risky China is as an investment, I mean, if you're raising the cost of capital there, but then lowering it in the US through the right sort of incentives, I think we have the money. That's the thing that I'm learning in this process is what America has as an advantage is really the capital. But we have to deploy that in ways that actually produce long-term security, that get us, I think, around this geopolitical problem and turbocharge our prosperity, our workforce development, our sort of reindustrialization, our supply chain security, all of that I think those are investable goods that may look pretty good in a world that's starting to be beset by geopolitical risk. And I'd love to see that done as much as possible by the private sector. I'd love to see it done by pensions. I'd love government to sort of show a little more clarity on where we're going and what we need to do, but then to create business cases for this, which I think is the way to go.
So you have some thoughts on that, on this, so tell some other view.
Sure, I think, there's a question we were discussing earlier is to what extent does U.S. policy have policy shortfalls, and to what extent does it have enforcement shortfalls? And might there be perhaps an optimistic way to characterize that, which is that the policy is all right, it's just the enforcement that is lacking. We are able to say that perhaps today in the area of some advanced semiconductor technology, where in the last few years, in the last administration and in this one, you had the beginning of the establishment of policy restrictions on the transfer of advanced semiconductors and advanced semiconductor technology to China. And on paper, that regime, as a matter of policy, is good and a lot better than it was just a few years ago. But the enforcement is a real challenge. It's a real challenge because we're not postured well for enforcement. I think, as Roz mentioned, even in terms of resources like staffing. We also have a regime that makes enforcement difficult. If we designate for restriction one company, we don't necessarily restrict flows to the company's subsidiaries or affiliates, let alone flows through third countries. So there's a Swiss cheese quality to the enforcement, even of those policies that are better and tougher. But the real bad news is that we have a policy problem that doesn't even allow us to yet have an enforcement problem in most of these areas. We don't yet have the policies in place, either on market access or on technology or on capital, to take Jonathan's 3 denials, that we need in most areas. And there are many, many examples of this. I guess I'll offer 2 quick ones, partly looking at the time. Even judging current policy by the standards of the current policy makers, Jake Sullivan gave a speech about 1.5 years ago where he laid out the 3 families of technologies that the current administration has identified as the key primary areas of technology competition with China, where we would want to maintain advantage, keep advantage, and apply restrictions as needed to do that. And the 3 families were computing, which included semiconductors, artificial intelligence, and quantum. The second family was biotechnology and biomanufacturing. And the third were clean energy technologies, including batteries and otherwise. And to oversimplify a bit, we have restrictive policies in those areas only very narrowly and selectively, largely on advanced semiconductors and in only initial ways elsewhere. So there are some initial restrictions on AI, but actually right now they're only either notional or preliminary. There have been kind of regulatory processes that have begun and said, in general, we're trying to get to a certain outcome, but the work is hard and we're starting it late. And so we don't even have the opportunity to ask, are we enforcing properly sensible AI restrictions? We haven't yet put them in place. In the EV sector, for example, we mostly have an IRA and other enormous new federal programs that are flowing, including to Chinese beneficiaries operating in the United States. There's a narrow restriction on the ability of consumers to get government subsidies to buy EVs straight from China. That's now restricted. But the use of subsidies by Chinese companies to do things like build batteries and sell them into the US market in ways that pose obvious leverage, vulnerability, data, and cybersecurity challenges is not restricted. In fact, it's promoted by the current regime. So it's not an enforcement problem, it's a policy problem. And then I would say, Jonathan ended with a mention of kind of capital flow questions and investment restrictions. There too, the policy conversation has moved a lot in the last 5 years or so. And that is notable because, the United States has a long and proud tradition of not favoring capital controls. And historically, that has served us extremely well. With respect to China, these days, given their strengths and the integration of our economies, including in finance, it's serving us very badly. And so we've begun to have a process really in policy terms in very narrow ways in 2020, in the last year of the Trump administration. The early Biden administration then accepted some of these very narrow initial kind of blacklists that restricted US public investment in the public securities of Chinese military associated companies. But that blacklist basically hasn't grown at all in the Biden years. In some ways, it's actually shrunk because whereas it initially covered the subsidiaries of those designated companies, it stopped doing that about 3 years ago. We have a discussion which the Biden administration has advanced on outbound restrictions that would restrict private equity and venture capital flows into advanced Chinese technology sectors, including semiconductors and AI and quantum. But those rules also are right now just notional. They're not in place. They're going through public review. It is hard. I mean, having deliberate processes for these where policymakers take the time to think things through themselves and to take public comment and to do things gradually can be very sensible because these things are hard. But frankly, the difficulty and the sensitivity and the disruptive quality and the fact that there's as much pushback from investors and from corporations every time a change like this happens really demonstrate how deep a hole we're in. Yep. Because the fact is, we've had a degree of integration in technology, in markets generally, and in finance that will be costly and disruptive to fix. But the fixes are really essential for national security.
Well, we can talk a lot about this, but we don't have so much time. I want to go to audience questions. I know someone, please, if you want to introduce yourself. And
yes, Jacob Snyder, incoming American Home Depot. So I can really understand how, hello, thank you. I can really understand how, preventing them from getting this market access and this technology in the future so they won't, reach like a parity to be a realistic threat. But what I want to ask you is, do you see a serious risk, essentially, to be like imposing these restrictions in such like a fast manner? Because I kind of think to like back to Japan in World War II, where we imposed like the steel and oil tariffs, and that seemed to be like the biggest, not tariffs, but like the actual restrictions, sanctions. And that to me, that was like the biggest, that's when they saw, oh, this is as much, we will only like start getting weaker from here. We need to like attack now. So do you think there might be that sort of like mentality?
So you mean taking economic action would accelerate a military response?
Yes,
okay.
Yes.
It's a great question.
Okay, look, I think that's a fair question. I mean, it's a very good one because, and we also have to remember what Japan was doing by that point. So they had already sent, multiple armies into China. At that time, China was a friend of ours. They were essentially rampaging across the Pacific, and in order to, do that, they needed American oil. And we said, maybe not, no more oil. So then they executed their war plans that had already been designed well in advance against the United States. So I think that stuff's already kind of, that analogy to me is a little different because it's already very built in. I mean, we were literally supporting a war effort through our economic engagement with Japan, and then to cut that off, as FDR decided to do, the war was already in progress, and the U.S. was not in it. The process of waking the U.S. up in the China context these days gives me enormous sympathy for those that tried to awaken America to the threats from the Axis in the 1930s. But I think today, we still have a shot to maintain deterrence. And even though in my book, the thrust of what I would want to do in strategy and policy is economic, it is completely useless and dangerous without a genuine successful deterrence strategy. I mean, you do not want to go down the road of economic containment with an adversary state if you do not have military superiority, if you do not have military deterrence. So in that sense, as a grand strategy, the reason it's a grand strategy book and not a sort of economic strategy book is because I address that. One has to. We have to get those two things right. The rest is ancillary. And they have to complement each other. And we have to create a virtuous cycle where American economic superiority, underpins American military superiority. And part of the challenge here is I didn't get into the economic side until doing a whole lot of work on the history of modern China. Finally realized, no, look, if we want to stop this, what could we possibly do? Okay, that's economic. But what I think they intend to do is ultimately to use force against the United States. They were prolific users of force in the 20th century when they were essentially an agrarian economy. Within essentially a year of founding the People's Republic of China, they were fighting the United States and the United Nations command in the Korean Peninsula right after a multi-million casualty civil war. Within a decade after that, within a couple decades, they'd fought the Soviet Union in a border war, India in a border war, eventually Vietnam. They were multiple Taiwan Straits crises. I mean, this was all integral to Mao's thinking about China's strategic geography, its rejuvenation. I mean, he didn't call it that back then. But I don't think we get to diffuse that problem by being polite. We've spent 40 years giving them the keys to the kingdom, the red carpet. You couldn't possibly give them more than what we've already given. The question at this point is, how do you execute on those two fronts? Economic deterrence, put them together, box this in, win the century.
Thank you.
We could go on, but I want to respect the schedules of everyone here. I'm sure that our panelists will be here a little bit afterwards if you have individual questions, but please join me in thanking Jonathan Ward, Roslyn Layton, and David Feith.
Okay.